The judge lifts the gavel and brings it down once. The room tightens. 90 years. First-degree murder. The words leave no air behind them. The defendant does not move. His jaw locks in a posture he thinks is strength. The earlier smirk, photographed at arraignment, belongs to another animal. What sits here now is a quiet mask, with nothing beneath it but a long hallway. A woman in the second row rises before she is recognized. "Your Honor, I need to speak." Her voice is steady. She does not look at her son. He does not look at her. A still image from a doorbell camera hangs in memory. A grainy frame, stamped with 10:12 p.m., 17 seconds that rewrote a house. By the end of this story, a belt loop, a ringtone, and a glance across a kitchen island will explain why a family argument became a life sentence. We rewind to the night. Riverton sits beyond the last exit, where shopping plazas give up and the prairie resumes. Houses are practical and square. Porches hold pumpkins long past Halloween. A basketball hoop leans over a cul-de-sac like an elder who remembers when noise lived here. By day, wind pulls a ribbon of dust across dry lots. At night, porch bulbs throw faint citrus halos, and motion sensors bless raccoons as intruders. Inside 1438 Harrow Finch Lane, a crescent of water dries on the counter where a glass had sweated and gone. A ceramic bowl with cracked glaze holds keys, a tape measure, and a fading business card. Reeves Mechanical, blue letters thinning with every thumbprint. On the refrigerator, magnets pin receipts, and a Polaroid of a father and a son shoulder to shoulder in summer glare, both squinting like men who distrust sunglasses. The father is Daniel Reeves, 48, a working man who learned honesty from residential attics that trap heat like a kiln. His voice on job sites is measured. His invoices arrive when they should. Neighbors nod to him at the mailbox and wish their days stacked as neatly. He is not a man people gossip about. He is the kind they rely on without noticing. The son is Nolan Reeves, 17. A senior by calendar, a man-child by posture. He can take small machines apart and, when patience holds, make them whole again. Lately, patience has not held. Teachers notice the smirk first, that little theater of contempt teenagers deploy when consequences lose shape. The habit becomes strategy. Strategy becomes reflex. On that late fall evening, a brown leather belt hangs from a chair by the kitchen island. It is ordinary nick at the third hole, where a buckle bit once and learned. No one remembers who left it there. Objects enter a room, wait, and change a life. A portrait of Daniel should not flatter. It should account. He rises early, stacks tools by weight, returns calls he would rather avoid. He can cook eggs and a brutal chili. He sorts receipts by quarter with quiet pride. When angry, he speaks little. When hurt, he speaks not at all. 2 years ago, the divorce passed between addresses like migrating birds under a cloud ceiling. Nolan chose to live with his father first by default, then by habit, then because Wi-Fi worked and someone pointed at homework without reading the chapters. Daniel does not hug often. He buys new brake pads and leaves them in the garage with a post-it. "We'll do it Saturday." Haste. Neighbors see without intruding. The boy idling in a parked car to bathe in engine white noise. The man standing on the porch at dusk, palms braced on the railing, as if reading the street's pulse. It would be romantic to claim destiny steered them toward collision. The truth is cheaper. In a small house, every silence touches every wall. In the Polaroid, Nolan leans away without meaning to. Daniel's arm makes the bridge. A gust lifts the corner of a shade sail, and the lens blinks to white. Stare long enough and you can convince yourself there was warning. Stare longer and you recognize what the prosecutor will later call it. Embroidery sewn after the fact. At 10:13 p.m., the emergency line connects. The dispatcher's voice carries no friendship and no judgment. Only a bridge. "What is your emergency?" A boy's breath hits the microphone, words clipped by a throat not used to pleading. "My dad, he's not breathing." The address lands. "Is he conscious?" "No." "Is he breathing?" "I don't know." The script takes over. Put the phone on speaker. Start compressions. Count with me. A phone rattles on laminate. A faucet drips. The rhythm is wrong. Far away and then nearer, a siren threads the fabric of the block. The boy counts, stumbles, counts again. Somewhere, a dog barks as if reading weather. Later, the transcript will be printed in Courier and slipped beneath a plastic sleeve, looking smaller than it sounded. The prosecutor will call it a performance, with a fatal tell. The defense will call it a child in shock. Both will be partly right and mostly strategic. Officer Janelle Ortiz enters first. Her body camera blooms to blue and captures a kitchen too bright for midnight. She notes the body's position on the floor near the island, and a belt lying close by, looped in a shape language hesitates to fix. She does not narrate for the camera. She breathes, scans for safety, and begins a sequence she could perform in her sleep, and later, only in her dreams. Confirm unresponsiveness. Request medical priority. Preserve what must be preserved by refusing to step where instinct urges. Nolan stands 6 feet away, arms slack, phone on the counter still lit with the call clock. He looks at Ortiz as if she has interrupted a plan. She asks him to step back. Paramedics arrive and the kitchen contracts to a square of practiced economy. A gloved hand glances at the belt and then does not look again. Because work demands focus. Ortiz sees the glance and lodges it in memory without moving her eyes. Later, much later, footage will slow to half speed and then quarter to show 2 things at once. Professional neutrality in the blue uniforms, and Nolan's face at the second the AED speaks. No shock advised. The metronome of compressions clicks against the wrong clock. In the living room, a wall clock ticks out of sync, as if refusing to join the scene. At 10:28 p.m., the attempt ends. A county timekeeper writes a line. Ortiz inhales and calls for a detective, for an on-call prosecutor, for a crime scene tech, with patience and gloves. She is not thinking about guilt. She is thinking about preservation. The belt lies where it lies. Silence becomes a temporary witness. Detective Marco Salazar arrives a little after 11 with a notebook and the kind of patience that makes other people talk. He asks for light that is not the kitchen glare. The softer, practical light of laptops, chargers, and evidence bags with white labels. Ortiz gestures once toward the belt, and the body now shielded by a privacy screen. Salazar does not approach. He asks about neighbors, cameras, and the small electronics by which modern streets film themselves to sleep. Riverton is a web of doorbells that send notifications and porch lights, married to phones. Ortiz begins a canvas. Salazar texts the digital forensics tech, Priya Nayar, and requests write blockers, spare drives, and cheerful skepticism. At 11:26 p.m., a neighbor named Amir Dastgir answers his Ring camera remotely from a night shift across town. He authorizes temporary access to the last 12 hours of motion events and apologizes for the mess on his porch as if the camera could be embarrassed. On a tablet propped against a box of nitrile gloves, Salazar watches a quiet street performing itself. At 10:12 p.m., a shape cuts across the Reeves driveway. Young posture, hurried. Slice of movement, shoulders tight, head down. Infrared flares a face and then loses it to angle. 17 seconds and the clip ends. Dastgir's device offers a second angle. 2 houses down. A porch light blinks on and off. And at just past 10:12, the Reeves front door closes. 3 seconds later, the 911 call will begin. Clock drift matters. Priya calculates the offset between the doorbell timestamps and the county system and writes it on a post-it, +2, 3 seconds. The number will travel through exhibits and cross-examination like a stone that keeps its shape. They hash the files, copy them, log them. Chain of custody begins as an idea and hardens into signatures. By morning, the block becomes a diagram. Salazar prefers paper for this part. Circles for houses with cameras, squares for those with dogs, arrows for the path of someone in a hurry with something to hide or a story to invent. Priya collects what the public sees without trying to. A city traffic camera at the nearest intersection. A convenience store lens that watches nothing and catches everything. Social feeds are scanned for late-night clips that drag accidental evidence behind them, like seaweed. Municipal cameras offer an egalitarian blur. The convenience store is less forgiving. At 9:54 p.m., it records Nolan in a hoodie paying cash for an energy drink and leaving after glancing at a display of prepaid phones. He does not buy a phone. He buys gum. He will not chew it. At 10:07 p.m., the same camera sees a dark sedan idle at the corner where Harrow Finch Lane meets the wider road. A bumper sticker blocks the license plate reader. At 10:10, the sedan leaves. At 10:12, Riverton performs its ordinary night, until it doesn't. Salazar visits the morgue to listen, not to draw conclusions. The medical examiner, Dr. Helen Cross, is exact. Findings consistent with compressive neck injuries. No defensive wounds. No evidence of prolonged struggle. She keeps language provisional, allowing data to arrive before the mind finishes the story. Back at the house, CSU photographs and swabs. The belt is bagged and labeled. The buckle gets dusted for prints. A swab drinks skin oils from the inner leather where memory has no vote. Nolan waits in a living room that has the wrong number of chairs. His posture negotiates between slouch and stall. His eyes avoid the idea of the belt without searching for it. He offers coffee to no one. Salazar tells him they need to talk, not here. He says it kindly. Like a teacher before a test he knows a student will not pass. Probable cause is not a feeling. It is a scaffold of facts fastened with sworn words. Salazar dictates an affidavit. Assistant District Attorney Kara Mitchell trims it for judges who read at speed before dawn. The affidavit lists a deceased adult male identified as Daniel Reeves, observed belt near the body. The emergency call initiated by resident Nolan Reeves. Doorbell footage showing a subject matching Nolan's build and clothing re-entering at 10:12 and change. A time correlation with the 10:13 call. Preliminary medical findings consistent with compressive neck injury, the absence of forced entry, and initial utterances that do not sit comfortably with the scene as found. Kara adds a line she has used before, "In my training and experience." Defense lawyers dislike the phrase. Judges accept it, the way pilots accept turbulence. The request seeks authority to seize and search the residence. Nolan's phone and personal effects, computers, any vehicles connected to the address, neighbor doorbells by consent or formalization, and biological samples as the law allows. At 4:38 a.m., a duty judge signs. The signature is sleep-tidy, imperfect, and sufficient. The warrant becomes a passport. Every object must say its piece. The phone is seized. Nolan asks what happens next with the tone of someone whose evening plan has been interrupted. Transportation to the station is uneventful. No handcuffs. Simply no better seat. Riverton slides past the cruiser window like a town he has already outgrown. Interview room A is small by design. 2 chairs, a table, a camera with the patience of an insect. Priya starts the recorder. A wall monitor stamps time without sympathy. Kara observes behind glass with a notebook that collects one-line hypotheses. Shock, staging, impulse control, learned contempt. She has tried cases where a juvenile face seduced juries into mercy and watched that mercy sour into regret. Salazar enters with a bottle of water and the respectful politeness that reads as dignity even to teenagers who don't trust adults. He confirms the name and date of birth. Nolan is 17. His mother is reachable. He is not under arrest. Salazar reads the Miranda warnings anyway and asks if Nolan understands. Nolan says yes, with the bored timbre of a student reciting a pledge. He signs a waiver with a pen that glides too easily. The camera notes the angle of his wrist and the half-smile that looks more like a shield than a plan. Defense attorneys hate such expressions. Jurors love them when they belong to villains. Tell me about your night. I was home. All night? Mostly. What does mostly mean? I went out for a drink. Silence is allowed to work. A chair adjusts. A notebook opens like a recipe for patience. What time did you get back? I don't know. After 10. Did you see your father? He was on the floor. What did you do? Called 911. The facts align too quickly. Kara writes 2 words in the margin. Preloaded narrative. Was there anyone else in the house? No. Any argument earlier? We didn't talk much. Salazar slides a photograph across the table, not of the body, not anything lurid, just the belt in a clear bag, labeled, ordinary, incontrovertibly present. Nolan's eyes find it, and then pretend not to. Is this yours? It's a belt. Did you use it? No. Another silence settles, heavier now. Weather moving in. We have doorbell footage of you returning just before the call, Salazar says. You see the problem? The boy gives a smile that is not a smile. I was fast. Kara closes her notebook without triumph. The problem is not proof. The problem is the story he believes he is telling, and the one the room is recording. An arrest is not a moral climax. It is a decision about timing and risk. Kara weighs what they have against what could be lost if they wait. Evidence can sour. Phones can be wiped. A teenager who still thinks in dares can do something irreversible. She authorizes the arrest and requests that a juvenile officer be notified along with Nolan's mother. Paperwork begins to accumulate like frost. When the cuffs finally close, they do so without spectacle. Nolan looks at them as if they are a costume. He asks if he can call someone. He is told he can, after processing. He nods like a boy who has learned that nodding moves adults faster than arguing. In the corridor, his reflection stares at him from a dark window. It is not the smirk he expects. It is a mask that leaks around the eyes. That evening, the community reads the headline without knowing the house. Neighbors rehearse small memories and decide which ones matter. A friend swears he saw Nolan laughing at lunch, and that laughter is now a clue. A teacher rereads a discipline note and finds omens between the lines. At 1438, Harrow Finch Lane, silence has the weight of a sealed room. The belt is a barcode inside a locker. The Polaroid waits on the fridge. The glass ring on the counter fades by morning. At the station, Salazar begins the inventory no one watches on television. Hand receipts, evidence seals, log entries that make a case survivable months later when the story has been retold into something prettier. Kara drafts the first motion she knows the defense will file. Suppress the interview, exclude the belt, attack the timing, argue that a juvenile cannot waive what he does not understand. She writes with the calm of someone who expects the blow and has decided not to blink. By the time Dawn pins a pale ribbon over the front range, the outline is drawn. A father without a breath. A son with a story. A timeline that keeps pointing to 10, 12, and a belt that refuses to be just leather. Somewhere in the city, a woman wakes before her alarm and understands that her day now has a courthouse in it. She is a mother, and she will be asked to choose between the truth and the habits that have kept her son from meeting it. Processing takes longer than television promises. Forms are read aloud and initialed. Property is inventoried into gray bins that already carry the smell of other nights. Fingerprints lay down a map Nolan has never seen. He watches the ink like it is dirt that will come off with better soap. He asks once more if he can call someone. He can, after this next part, a phrase that keeps moving forward one door at a time. Juvenile intake has a quieter hallway. The sergeant on duty speaks as if handling glass. Nolan offers the names he is required to offer. His mother, Linda. A school counselor he barely knows. A friend he should not call. The sergeant dials Linda. The message goes to voicemail and becomes its own record of the hour. She is called again, then reached. She is on her way. Kara sits with Salazar and reviews what the camera in interview room A has already captured. The flat affect, the careful minimalism, the moment the photograph of the belt settled on the table like a test nobody studied for. They discuss risk. Continue the interview when the mother arrives with counsel. Or hold what they have and build with forensics. Kara weighs the tone of Nolan's answers against the timeline that clicks like a metronome behind every fact. She decides to finish the circle they started. But by the book, no pressure, no raised voice, no martyr moves that make defense exhibits later. When Linda arrives, she looks as if the day did not grant her permission to change clothes. She signs where the receptionist points and asks too softly whether her son is all right. The receptionist cannot offer adjectives. A juvenile liaison explains rights again, and the right to an attorney. Linda listens with the stunned concentration of someone translating a language she knew as a child, but hasn't spoken in years. They sit with Nolan in a room that is legally adequate and emotionally unkind. He does not stand when she enters. She sits anyway and studies his face. Looking for a younger boy, he keeps his eyes on the table and finds the wood grain suddenly fascinating. Salazar repeats the warnings and asks if Nolan wants to stop. A lawyer can be called. Nolan glances at his mother and says he will keep talking. Linda's eyes flick to Kara and then back to her son, as if deciding where gravity lives. "Tell us about the belt," Salazar says, and leaves the words alone where they land. Nolan rests his chin in his palm. "It is just a belt," he says, and the sentence hangs like a wire. "Did you hold it in your hand tonight?" Salazar asks. Nolan allows one small nod and then shakes his head, a movement so brief it registers as static. His mother inhales. The camera does not. Salazar walks through the hour between 9 and 10 with steps light enough not to break the surface. Nolan's answers are short. A drink run, a walk, a return. The doorbell frames show him cutting across the driveway. The call connects within a minute. The distance between those points is not wide enough to hide a stranger. Nolan sees the trap and chooses a different map. "We were arguing earlier," he says. "About what?" "Nothing. Money. School. Stupid stuff. Did you touch him?" "He fell," Nolan says. And the word thuds, with the weight of wishful thinking. Kara does not move. She speaks in a tone that would be right for a child learning to cross the street. "Falling leaves marks in places we can see and measure. Those marks are not here. Help me understand." Nolan's jaw returns to its idea of strength. "We grappled," he says, the syllables aspirated like steam. He says grappled again, as if the second time makes it more accurate. "Did you put anything around his neck?" "No." "Why is there a belt on the floor?" "It was there." "Did you pick it up?" "Maybe." "For what?" "I don't know." Silence extends. Linda weeps without sound and then stops as if someone turned off a faucet. She asks her son if he wants a lawyer. He shrugs in a way that can be read as courage or surrender. Kara repeats the offer. Nolan signs again that he understands and continues. He rubs his thumb over a callus on his middle finger, as if it were an eraser that could lighten whatever the camera has already taken down. Salazar opens a folder and removes a single paper. A still image cropped from the convenience store camera at 9:54 p.m. It shows Nolan's face in profile as he looks at a pegboard of prepaid phones. "You bought gum," Salazar says. "Why did you study the phones?" Nolan says he was bored. Salazar does not contest the claim. He slides another paper. A receipt from Reeves Mechanical on the fridge dated last month. A note about delinquent accounts. A number circled twice. "Did you and your father argue about money?" Nolan says he doesn't remember. Linda closes her eyes and nods, as if Nolan's answer reaches back 2 years and straightens a picture frame. The interview turns to small mechanics. Salazar asks Nolan to demonstrate where he stood and how he moved. He places a belt on the table, the one from evidence stays in its bag. This is a training prop. He asks Nolan to show how one person might hold it in both hands if they were angry and stupid and scared and not thinking. Kara watches the boy's wrists. Nolan refuses the demonstration. He says he doesn't need to play games. He says his father was already on the floor when he came back. He says the belt was just there, like a bad joke. Kara changes lanes. She asks about growing up in a house where apologies were rare and instruction arrived as a list of tasks. She asks about the smirk teachers wrote down in discipline logs as defiance. She asks if Daniel ever put his hands on Nolan in punishment and, if so, when that stopped. Nolan's mouth tightens. He says his father was strict. He says strict like it is a diagnosis. He does not say hurt. He says standards. The clock slides past noon. Counsel arrives, a public defender named Evan Pierce, sharp eyes and a gentleness that hides steel. He introduces himself to both mother and son and asks for 10 minutes alone. Kara offers the room and the recorder stops with an audible click that marks a chapter break. In the hallway, Salazar tells Kara that Nolan is a boy who learned contempt as a second language. Kara nods and says second languages can be unlearned when the grammar of consequence becomes clear. When the recorder resumes, Nolan looks smaller, as if the chair decided to grow. Pierce places a hand on the table in a way that suggests anchoring rather than comfort. He says they will answer only what is necessary, and that they will stop if the questions shade into speculation. Salazar agrees. He is not hunting for eloquence. He wants the simplest line that connects the belt to the timeline without breaking. Pierce leads. Nolan, tell them what you told me, using your words. Nolan swallows. He says he and his father argued in the kitchen about grades, about a job he was supposed to start at the shop, about being home late. He says his father told him to hand over his phone, and he refused because it felt like being erased. He says Daniel reached for the device, and Nolan pulled away. He says Daniel's foot caught the chair leg and there was a stumble. He says he grabbed at whatever was close to keep distance. He says a belt was in his hand and then everything was noise. He says he let go and his father was on the floor and the kitchen got very bright. Kara asks whether Nolan placed the belt around Daniel's neck at any point. Nolan's breathing goes shallow. He says he doesn't think so. Kara does not accept verbs that sleep standing up. She asks again, with fewer syllables. Nolan says he does not remember. Pierce ends the line and announces they will not answer that question further. The statement sits there, insufficient and alive. What follows is not a confession. It is an admission wrapped in fog. Nolan acknowledges contact, anger, and the presence of a strap in his hands. He denies intention. He suggests accident by tone rather than by narrative. He gives the prosecution a spine and the defense a hope. Kara thanks him without inflection and ends the session. Pierce asks for immediate juvenile placement and no further questioning without him present. Everyone agrees because the day has already taken more than it should. The booking photo takes a second that will last months. Nolan attempts neutrality and lands on disdain. The image will become a thumbnail on news sites by evening. Smirking teen. The caption writers will think and then choose a synonym that sounds less judgmental and sells the same view. A reporter stands outside the station and speaks into a November wind that scours the edges of her vowels. The town learns the name that was only a mailbox yesterday. Linda drives home by streets that have not moved but feel relocated. She parks in her driveway and does not go inside. She looks at the porch light and decides it is too bright for the idea of night. Across the street, a curtain shifts. The neighborhood has recalibrated to a tone that makes every sound a rumor. On her phone, a message appears from a number she does not know, asking if she is the mother and if she wants to comment. She deletes it, and the deletion is no relief at all. Kara's office becomes the center of a rotating map. She meets with Salazar and the forensics team to plan the week, as if planning could stand between them and chaos. The belt goes to the lab. The buckle will be examined for trace. The inner leather will be swabbed for epithelial cells, and a profile built if there is anything to build. The kitchen floor will be read like a palimpsest. What moved, what didn't, what tried to lie. The phone will be mirrored, and its timeline compared to everything else, until the contradictions announce themselves. If intention can be proved, it will not be by speeches. It will be by seconds and pressure. Pierce begins his own map. He requests school records, counseling notes, and the discipline file everyone swears is sealed, and that, with effort, can be read. He calls a psychologist who specializes in adolescents whose emotional thermostats are broken. He asks Linda for history and receives stories that are both ordinary and edged. A boy who pushed boundaries because boundaries did not push back hard enough. A father who enforced rules with the moral seriousness of a ledger. Pierce's strategy is not to deny the kitchen. It is to persuade that a 19-year-old brain deserves a future after a terrible minute. The first hearing arrives quickly. The courtroom wears its weekday face. Nolan appears in juvenile attire, the costume of diminished agency. He sits beside Pierce and keeps still with the focus of someone trying to be a statue. Kara moves for detention pending trial. She describes risk of flight, community safety, and the integrity of the investigation. Pierce counters with ties to the area, school attendance, and the absence of any prior record that involves harm. The judge listens with an expression that does not change because it belongs to the job. Detention is ordered with limited privileges, schoolwork, supervised visits, and monitored calls. A no-contact order is entered regarding Linda, except through counsel, until the prosecution finishes interviews. Linda nods as if the order were a sentence she must repeat to someone else later. Nolan is led out through a side door that he cannot hold open by will. His eyes flick to the gallery and land on nobody. The door closes with a sound the hallway eats. News coverage warms to its task. Producers lace footage of the quiet cul-de-sac with file photos of doorbells and belts, and timers counting down seconds as if morality were a stopwatch. A commentator mentions adolescent impulse control and then quotes a statistic that sounds clinical, merciful, and beside the point. Another segment runs an old yearbook photo in which Nolan smiles without defense. The contrast does the editorializing for them. Kara sees the coverage and turns off the television. Trials are not won in living rooms. She refocuses on the lab queue and the 2 interviews she wants to schedule. A neighbor who heard a thud, and a friend who received a text from Nolan just after 10 that read, "Nothing. Numb. Back soon." She drafts subpoenas with the efficiency of someone building scaffolding in a wind. Facts will be the weight that steadies this build. Pierce meets Nolan at detention. The boy looks relieved to see a familiar face that belongs to the same day. Pierce explains the next steps in the tone of a coach discussing film before a rematch. He says there will be a motion to suppress portions of the interview based on age and comprehension. He says there will be experts who can speak to adolescent development and the way time stretches under stress. He says remorse is not strategy, but it helps. Nolan nods and asks if 90 years is a real number. Pierce says it is a number people say when they need to be sure the conversation is over. He says their job is to reopen the conversation. Evening brings a fragile quiet. Kara drives past the convenience store and watches the automatic doors breathe open for a stranger. Salazar stands outside 1438 Harrow Finch Lane and listens to nothing long enough to be sure he has heard it. Linda sits at the kitchen table of a friend and decides to tell the truth when it is asked of her. In a locker at the crime lab, a belt waits. In a hard drive mirror, a phone waits. In the county calendar, a date is penciled for a hearing that will consider moving a case from juvenile to adult court. The pencil line looks thin. It will not remain so for long. The courthouse wakes before the city does. Night custodians finish polishing its long corridors, and the floors try on the idea of sunlight. The docket prints itself into columns that sound neutral when read aloud and feel heavy to the names printed there. The Reeves matter appears as a line among many, a small engine that will pull the rest of the day behind it. In detention attire, Nolan sits beside his lawyer at counsel table and practices stillness. Cameras are not allowed inside, but cameras are always somewhere. A sketch artist sharpens a pencil and decides whether the boy's mouth curves up when at rest or whether the curve is an invention. The judge takes the bench and invites ritual to begin its work. The hearing is about custody and conditions, and what the next 30 days should look like when the future has already been named too loudly outside. Kara recites the familiar architecture: risk of flight, potential intimidation of witnesses, the need to safeguard evidence. She mentions the belt without adjectives, and the timestamps without drama. She speaks in the tone of someone who has learned that a calm recital of sequence is more persuasive than thunder. Pierce answers in the vocabulary of ties: school, community, a mother whose presence is steady even when her voice is not. He offers an alternative to detention in the form of a tightly supervised program that will read like prison without bars. He acknowledges the facts not as mountains but as hills. Everyone is still measuring. He says the word accident and lets it sit without decoration. The judge looks at Nolan while lawyers speak, a habit that keeps hearings honest. The boy meets the gaze for a beat, and then lowers his eyes in the way teenagers do when authority asks them whether they know how young they still are. Detention remains in place with conditions adjusted to permit more schoolwork and monitored counseling sessions. The routine is set like a metronome no one can turn off. Outside, microphones wait for sentences that can be edited into meaning. The public thinks in end states: guilty or not, monster or mistake, lock him away or save him. The law thinks in ladders and steps and paperwork that keeps everyone from sprinting to the cliff. A reporter describes the belt as if the leather itself possessed motive. Another mentions the doorbell camera as a neighbor that never forgets. At detention, Nolan encounters the slow mathematics of time. School assignments arrive in packets. He stares at a paragraph on thermodynamics and wonders how anything remains constant anywhere. In a group session, he keeps quiet until someone else talks about fathers. He watches the clock until it becomes a drawing that no longer measures anything. He learns the names of guards, the way you learn the names of neighbors when you are not going anywhere. Kara reads lab updates the way gamblers read cards, suppressing superstition. The belt's inner leather yields mixed cells that will take longer to separate into a profile. The buckle collects latent prints, some partial, some usable. The kitchen floor tells a simpler story. 2 sets of shoe impressions. A shuffle where a chair leg struck linoleum. A heel pivot, consistent with someone shifting weight and bracing. The report refuses to declare intention and thereby does its job. The phone gives up its hours in orderly lines. A music app runs at 9:40 p.m. A message at 10. 2 reads. Back soon. A search at 10:05 asks how long before paramedics get there. At 10:11, the flashlight turns on. The screen locks at 10 hours, 11 minutes, and 47 seconds. The emergency call begins at 10:13 and 12 seconds. Kara runs her finger under the times like a teacher guiding a student toward the right answer without saying it aloud. Pierce orders his own reading of the phone data and sees instead a boy trying to understand catastrophe as it arrives. The flashlight could be panic. The search could be fear. He prints the logs on paper and rehearses the story where numbers refuse to choose a side. He meets with a psychologist, Dr. Adrian Thorne, who speaks about adolescent brains as architectures still under scaffolding. Thorne's words are cautious and clinical. He does not promise redemption. He promises context. Linda meets with Kara in a small conference room whose table has seen decades of worry. She sits upright and keeps her hands on her knees to prevent the old habit of apologizing for whatever is happening in front of her. Kara explains what will be asked of her later and why. Linda nods when told the truth will hurt and hurt clean, and the other thing will hurt forever. In the evening, the house on Harrow Finch Lane feels observed even when no one is parked outside. Mail gathers. A neighbor mows with headphones, and the mechanical whine sounds like an alibi. The porch light learns to switch on at odd hours. The kitchen holds a vague smell of latex, camera flash, and bleach that pretends it is the absence of everything. At the next hearing, the argument is about transfer. The county seeks to move Nolan into adult court for trial, citing the seriousness of the charge and the public's stake in a verdict that speaks in adult sentences. Pierce resists, not on facts, because facts do not bend here, but on principle and prospects. He says 17 is not 30. He says futures close too easily when grown people need easy closure. Experts have their day under oath. Dr. Cross testifies to what she can say and withholds what she cannot. Findings consistent with compressive neck trauma. No defensive wounds, no prolonged struggle. She adds that the absence of marks does not coronate accident, nor does it crown intent. She leaves the crown on the table for the jury that will someday sit here. A digital analyst walks the court through the doorbell timelines as if arranging photos on a mantle. He explains clock drift and why 2.3 seconds matters less than the choreography of light, shadow, and entry. He resists conclusions. He holds up a still image that contains a boy-shaped fact and puts it down. The courtroom listens not for thunder but for small clicks as several pieces find their neighbors. From the juvenile wing's waiting area, a local columnist catches Nolan leaving with deputies. The boy glances sideways for 1 beat longer than necessary, and a camera catches it like a trout. The frame becomes the face of the case online. A slight curl at the mouth misread as daring, or read too precisely as contempt. Smirk becomes label. Labels become facts in places where thinking is hired out to photographs. Pierce drafts a letter to editors reminding them that a juvenile remains a juvenile, that a face is an unreliable narrator, that grief loves villains because villains take up less space than complexity. He does not send it. He saves energy for the courtroom where ethics are enforceable, and for a boy who will need basic sentences spoken slowly when trial comes. Kara calls a meeting of the team to review weak joints. One detective worries about the interview and whether a 17-year-old can truly waive what he cannot calculate. Kara answers that they did not push, and that counsel joined before the boy said the words that matter. She does not call those words a confession because they are not. She calls them admission of contact under stress, proximity to mechanism, Awareness of consequence after the fact. The team nods because precision is the only thing keeping them from believing their own movie. Linda sits with a counselor and practices telling the truth without rehearsing guilt. She names every time she rescued Nolan from consequence because she was tired or sad or both. She names the times she blamed Daniel for being the rule when she wanted to be the apology. She learns there is a word for it that is not cruelty, but it is not kindness either. Enabling feels to her like a fuse she kept pinching but never blew out. In detention, Nolan receives a letter from an old friend written in the style of people who have never met courtrooms. It says, "Bro, I know you. You wouldn't do that." He reads it twice and then folds it into a smaller square until it can be hidden in the spine of a workbook. He dreams of a kitchen where light is gentle and wakes to light that never changes. A week later, the transfer hearing concludes with the judge reading from a standard that tries to be both shield and sword. The question is not whether the act is adult, but whether the actor can be trusted with the juvenile system's brief horizon. The judge's voice is even. The factors line up like fence posts. Seriousness of the offense, sophistication, prior record, rehabilitation prospects, the public interest. The court announces it will take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling soon. Soon is the most elastic word in law. Kara walks to her car and feels the thin Colorado air scrape the back of her throat. She has tried cases where anger carried the day and then evaporated on appeal. She is building this one like a bridge designed for trucks heavier than any that will cross. She will not rely on one plank. She needs the belt, the phone, the path across the driveway, the quiet way a chair leg can draw a map on linoleum, the sentence about a flashlight at 10:11 that has no business being there unless somebody was searching for something they had just done. Pierce, in his office lit by a lamp that tries to be warmer than the world, writes the opening paragraph of a motion he will file, even if the transfer is granted. Development, science. Impulsivity, a single catastrophic minute. The possibility of a later self who can carry what this one did without repeating it. He hears the counter-arguments in his own sentences and sharpens them anyway. The ruling arrives on a Tuesday morning at 9:03 a.m. An email pings like a small bell in 3 inboxes at once. The court grants the transfer. Nolan will be tried as an adult. The order is written in a prose that pretends it is not about a teenager because the law functions better that way. Pierce reads it twice and underlines a sentence nobody will quote on the news. The community's interest in accountability at adult scale outweighs the rehabilitative goals available in juvenile disposition. There is no ceremony to mark the new status. Nolan's clothes will change when he appears again. Pierce explains the difference between juvenile and adult arraignment in a voice that does not change, because change will be noticed. Nolan hears only that words have longer shadows now. He asks whether a jury will see him as a man. Pierce answers that the jury will see a person, and that their job is to make sure person comes before label. Arraignment feels like a formality to professionals, and like a cliff to families. The indictment is read. The words first degree enter the room and alter its temperature. Nolan says not guilty. His voice does not shake, which will be read later as arrogance by some, and as shock by others. Dates are set. Deadlines line up like mile markers on a road. None of them wanted to be traveling together. The prosecutor's office releases a short statement that speaks only of process and patience. The defense releases one that speaks of tragedy and a boy's future in the balance. Comment sections perform their ritual. In the margins, someone writes that a belt is not a gun, and that should matter. Someone else writes that hands make belts into weapons, and that should matter more. The argument will not be settled there. It will be settled in a room with no comments allowed. On a gray Wednesday, Kara stands before a whiteboard that has become a map of the kitchen in dry erase lines. She points to the island, to the chair leg, to a circle where the phone likely rested on speaker while a boy counted compressions. She draws a slender loop with a marker and cannot help seeing leather. She writes 10. 12 inches block numerals beside the front door and watches how the number feels bigger when it is alone. Pierce drives to Linda's apartment and sits at her table. He tells her the case will not be about 1 minute only. It will be about a life in which minutes were allowed to multiply without boundaries. He says the prosecution will try to show a boy who learned contempt and then practiced it until it looked like identity. He says, Their answer will be to show a brain that confuses a dead end for an escape route. He asks whether, when the time comes, she can say the words that make both pictures true. She says she can. She looks as if she has already begun, and has not stopped since. In the jail library, Nolan selects a thin book because thick books pretend at mercy, and then take it back. He reads a chapter and forgets it while reading it. He tries to remember the exact sound the gavel made at the first hearing and cannot. He tries to remember if his father ever borrowed his belt and cannot. He remembers the kitchen light and wishes it would tell the story for him. Trial prep spills into weekends. Subpoenas fan out. An evidence clerk practices saying chain of custody without swallowing a syllable. The lab pushes the mixture sample through a more sensitive process that may pull a profile clear enough to satisfy rules the jury will never hear about. A jury consultant leaves a memo that says the case will be decided by two things: whether the smirk hardens in the jurors' minds, and whether the mother breaks their hearts without asking for it. The calendar says winter has not started. The air says otherwise. Everyone involved learns to breathe steam and continue talking. Inside, a locked drawer, the belt waits for its second appearance. It will be introduced not as a symbol, but as an object with a chain of events attached to it. In a different drawer, the Polaroid waits too, unwilling to be evidence, and unwilling to be a memory that asks nothing of anyone. Jury selection drains 3 days into small questions asked politely. Strangers try on belief systems in public. A retired nurse says she can be fair even if belts make her think of restraints. A math teacher says he trusts numbers, which is not the same as trusting people who recite them. A warehouse supervisor says teenagers scare him when they pretend not to be scared. They nod through instructions as if assembling furniture with more steps than parts. By Thursday afternoon, 12 people and 2 alternates carry the project forward. They sit with the posture of passengers who have finally fastened their belts and accepted the rules about seatbacks. The judge thanks them for their time and warns them about the diet they must now observe. No news, no research, no conversations about belts, doorbells, or the way kitchens can become courtrooms. Opening statements belong to persuasion without argument. Kara stands where the floor does not creak and offers the case like a map someone can follow without a guide. She does not raise her voice. She draws a line from 10:12 to 10:13 and marks the belt on the kitchen floor with a small circle labeled mechanism. She says the state will prove that Nolan Reeves, in anger and with intent, used that belt to compress his father's airway until life left and did not return. She promises the jury evidence, not adjectives. The 911 recording. The body camera. The doorbell timeline. The lab reports. And the words Nolan chose to say when given room to say nothing. She talks about responsibility like a tool that has fallen out of style. She mentions adolescence, but only to clarify that it explains impatience, not homicide. She gives Daniel Reeves a few sentences: working man, reliable, unremarkable in the way good men are, and refuses to canonize him. She ends by telling the jurors they will hear from Linda Reeves, and that what she says will be hard and truthful, and not offered to buy sympathy, but to remove illusions. When she sits, the room does not breathe for a moment, and then starts again, as if it had been holding its breath for a very long time. Pierce approaches with his jacket still buttoned and his notes held like a letter he is prepared to fold and put away. He thanks the jurors for agreeing to perform work that will not fit neatly back into their lives when it is done. He does not deny a kitchen, or a belt, or a dead father. He denies intention. He points to the minute that expands during shock, like a road in a heat mirage. He says adolescents make terrible decisions at speed, and then freeze inside them. He says the science of development may not absolve, but it should inform what we call a life defined by 1 minute. He frames Nolan as a boy who learned to look strong when he felt small, and who wore a smirk the way some kids wear headphones, as a boundary. He promises the jury that when they listen to the 911 call without captions built by hindsight, they will hear confusion and fear. He asks them to hold 2 pictures at once without letting either one bully the other. He sits, and Nolan's expression does not move because he has been told stillness is safer than anything else. The first witness is the 911 dispatcher, a woman whose voice belongs to 1,000 anonymous nights. She describes the call triage process and the steps she took. Verify location, assess consciousness, begin compressions. The recording plays. In a courtroom, a voice stripped of a face becomes a landscape you can step into. The jurors listen to the breath, the clatter of a phone on a counter, the count that stumbles and finds itself again. The prosecutor asks if anything struck the dispatcher as unusual. She says the call came very quickly after the stated discovery, which is not unusual, and that the caller followed instructions, which is also not unusual. She says the voice sounded young. She does not say performance. On cross, Pierce asks whether panic can make counting sound like acting, and whether she has heard calm voices in terrible emergencies. She says yes to both. He asks whether the words chosen by callers are reliable guides to intention. She says sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. The law nods, satisfied that contradictions were acknowledged, and then shelved for later. Officer Ortiz follows. Her body camera footage enters the record with the formality of ritual. Foundation laid, timestamps authenticated, chain of custody confirmed by an evidence clerk, whose precision makes boredom look like a virtue. The video tracks through the front door, past a hallway wall with family pictures that jurors glance at because this is how people live, into a kitchen that flares with light. The lens catches the body on the floor, and Andres's gloved hands, the AED pads, the belt lying to the side like a lowercase letter someone left out of a word. Kara freezes the frame to note positions. Ortiz narrates what she did and why she did it. Her voice does not seek credit. On cross, Pierce asks about alternative explanations consistent with what she observed. A fall, an accidental entanglement, the possibility that the belt was simply near an argument, not the instrument of its end. Ortiz agrees that the scene does not draw conclusions on its own. That is what laboratories and juries are for. She does not agree that the arrangement of objects felt random. It felt arranged by the movements of two people in a small space. The medical examiner testifies next in a tone that refuses narrative. She presents anatomy like a scaffolding and uses words that function whether or not anyone in the room wants them to. She describes compressive neck injuries and how they may occur, the range of pressures and durations, the markers that suggest manual versus ligature mechanisms, and the limits of inference when subcutaneous evidence is equivocal. She says the findings are consistent with a strap tightened across the front of the neck. She says the distribution of petechiae and the absence of deep fingernail abrasions are more consistent with a ligature than with hands. She does not ascribe motive or mental state. She does not need to. Pierce explores the borders of certainty. He asks about variability among individuals, differences in tissue response, the role of sudden collapse without prolonged struggle, and how a fall could mimic certain patterns. Dr. Cross acknowledges margins and repeats that her conclusions are limited to physiology. She is a careful witness because care is a kind of honesty, and jurors have a nose for it. A digital analyst from the department, not Priya yet, introduces the 10-12 timeline like a music score. Doorbell camera 1 sees a figure crossing a driveway. Doorbell camera 2 catches a porch light flicker. The Reeves door closes. The call begins. The analyst explains clock drift and how it was adjusted against the county system. Numbers are not dramatic until they organize themselves into choreography. When the clip ends, the room keeps listening for a second longer, as if sound could catch up with the silence. Pierce cross-examines with a courtesy that buys him attention. He asks whether 15 or 20 seconds could make the difference between arrival and discovery. Yes, the analyst says, but the intervals here are not that generous. He asks whether another person could have slipped in and out of frame in blind spots. The analyst says the cameras do not cover every angle, but that the absence of a shadow where one should be has its own evidentiary weight. Pierce lets the sentence live without stabbing it again. The evidence clerk returns to tell the untelevised story of seals and signatures. He walks the jury from kitchen to bag, to locker to lab to courtroom. He speaks about barcodes that glare if touched without right. He is cross-examined briefly by Pierce, who asks only whether any seal failed or any chain link ever looked weak. No. The answer is boring, and therefore perfect for the state. Priya finally takes the stand. She smiles with the humility of someone who knows jurors suspect magicians when they hear the word forensics. She refuses to be a magician. She is a translator. She describes how she mirrored Nolan's phone and built a timeline without altering the device. She points to the flashlight activation at 10:11 p.m., the lock at 10 hours, 11 minutes, and 47 seconds, The emergency call at 10 hours, 13 minutes, and 12 seconds. She overlays this on the doorbell images and lets the alignment speak. She adds that searches for response times can be read many ways, and she is not here to tell the jury how to read them. She is here to say the searches happened. Pierce asks about stress and how people Google the strange when the world tips. He asks whether someone could turn on a flashlight because a kitchen suddenly feels like a cave. Priya agrees that people do odd, human things in odd, human moments. She refuses to move from data to fiction. The edge of her honesty helps both sides for different reasons. Jurors write this down invisibly and do not know they have done it. Kara calls the friend who received the nothing, N-dub, back soon text. He is nervous and young and worries that casual slang has grown barbs in the courtroom air. He says Nolan texted like that all the time. He says he didn't think anything of it. He says he cannot remember when soon usually meant. On cross, Pierce thanks him for coming and asks nothing more, because the point has been made and does not benefit from being remade. The neighbor, Amir Dostgir, testifies with the mild embarrassment of a man whose doorbell suddenly matters. He confirms he granted access and that the clips are what they are. He talks about the night shift and how his phone buzzed at odd hours with raccoons and wind. He says he didn't see Nolan that night because he wasn't home. And the case will not be solved by asking him to have seen things. Linda watches from the second row, as if the air itself might fall. She has not yet been called. When the video shows a boy-shaped blur moving toward the front door, she does not blink. When the audio captures the first moments of the call, she folds her hands together in her lap, as if holding something heavy enough to require two hands. Pierce glances back once to measure whether a jury might mistake this stillness for coldness. He decides they will see it for what it is. Someone bracing for the worst version of the truth. Kara enters the belt through a lab witness who explains swabs, mixtures, and the way skin cells tell a story in pieces. The profile is mixed. Daniel's DNA is present. Another contributor's profile is consistent with Nolan to a statistical degree that sounds like science fiction, until you remember the number is only math. The defense stipulates to the relevance and fights the interpretation. Pierce asks whether a belt in a house would not naturally have the skin cells of everyone who lives there. The analyst agrees that is possible. Kara saves the point she will make in closing for later. Possible is not the same as probable in a kitchen where the belt is lying near where a man stopped breathing. An afternoon witness from the school district arrives with a slim file and a careful neutrality. She speaks about Nolan's intelligence, his uneven effort, and incidents that can be read a dozen ways with enough motive. A teacher noted a smirk and felt disrespected. Another noted a quiet that read like contempt but might have been fear of humiliation. Pierce uses the testimony to suggest a portrait of a boy who underperformed and hid behind posture. Kara lets it stand. There is no need to fight a portrait that will not change what happened at 10:12. As the day nears its end, the judge instructs the jury about not reading headlines that will bloom like algae overnight. They are excused into a hallway that sounds suddenly too loud after the courtroom's etiquette. Kara stacks her exhibits and does not linger over triumph. This is a brick-by-brick case, and the wall is only at the first row. Pierce visits Nolan in the holding room and speaks quietly. He says the jury watched and listened, and did not flinch. He says this is good news in a way. He says tomorrow will be about experts and mechanisms, and the kind of words Dr. Thorne can make into sunlight for a minute. Nolan nods. He asks whether his mother will speak. Pierce says not yet, but soon. Nolan stares at the seam of the table and presses his thumbnail into it until the skin around it pales. That night, Kara rereads her outline and draws boxes around 3 moments she must land. The flashlight, the belt's position, relative to the body and island, and the smirk that threatens to become more famous than the rest of the case. She resolves to avoid saying the word smirk aloud. Jurors will supply it on their own if it matters. If it does not, saying it will make it matter more than it should. Discipline is as much a trial skill as rhetoric. In another part of the city, Linda sits at a kitchen table that is not hers. She holds a mug that is cooled twice. She practices a sentence and stops halfway because it rearranges the furniture in her chest. She will have to say that she excused too much for too long. She will have to say that Daniel was the boundary, and she was the apology. She will have to say that she did not teach Nolan what happens when you lean too hard on excuses. She will have to say it while looking at the boy who learned from her how to survive, not how to live. When morning returns, the trial will continue its slow walk. The jurors will learn about tensile strength and about the way breath negotiates with pressure. They will hear a psychologist explain to them that the brain is not finished with itself at 17. They will watch a mother decide where love sits in the same room with justice. They will be asked to translate seconds into years. The arithmetic is cruel and necessary. The courtroom lights will hum. The door will close. The day will begin again, as if it had not already begun 100 times. The second day opens with diagrams. The courtroom grows a whiteboard and a stack of easel sheets that make the space look like a seminar nobody asked to attend. Kara draws a rectangle for the kitchen and a narrow oval for the island. She dots a small circle where the phone likely sat on speaker, according to the call's acoustic profile. She marks the place on the floor where paramedics began compressions and a foot to the side, where the belt was photographed. The room learns a new geography. An engineer explains belts in a way that removes metaphor. Leather, stitching, buckle geometry, failure modes. He talks about tensile strength under human load and demonstrates, with a strap he did not take from evidence, how a loop tightens when pulled from both ends and how pressure distributes across the front of a neck. He does not say the word choke. He says compress. The jurors try not to touch their own throats while they listen. On cross, Pierce walks the engineer into the wide field of possibility. Could a belt fall in such a loop if dropped during an argument? Yes. Could pressure be brief and catastrophic without leaving the marks television taught us to expect? Yes. Though that is not the common pattern. Could someone panic and pull without having first decided to do harm? The engineer says intent is a question for other witnesses and other rooms. Kara calls Dr. Cross again for a more granular tour through physiology. She uses a model of a neck and speaks about the airway as a soft tube guarded by cartilage, about vessels that mine pressure more than they mine narratives, about the time it takes for consciousness to dim once blood flow is pinched. She explains how small differences in angle matter a great deal, and how a strap can leave ambiguous skin stories when the duration is short and the force uneven. She does not upgrade her earlier conclusion. She simply makes it deeper. The jury hears the 911 call again, not because repetition is drama, but because repetition is how people learn. Kara lets the clip play without commentary and asks the dispatcher 2 short questions. Whether anything about the timing conflicts with the doorbell sequence, and whether the instructions were followed. No conflict. Yes, followed. The answer is boring, which in court often means durable. A crime scene analyst testifies about the kitchen floor. She talks about dusting for prints that did not survive bleach, about photographing micro-scratches in laminate, where chair legs moved, about a heel pivot that maps onto proximity to the belt if the person was facing the island. She resists adjectives. She adds that the scene was relatively tidy, which is either ordinary for a home or interesting for a fight depending on what you bring to it. Priya returns to fill a gap. Kara drew a box around the night before. She overlays the phone's light sensor log on the timeline and shows a brief spike that is consistent with the flashlight pointing down at a reflective surface. The kitchen's laminate qualifies. She maps the spike to 1011 and change, and does not pretend it is destiny. She calls it a piece. The jurors write that word on their faces as if each has a marker you cannot see. Pierce asks whether a person might turn on a flashlight to find a dropped object, or to check a pupil, or simply because panic wants light. Priya agrees that panic has its own physics. She does not agree that the spike can be ignored. They leave it there, a small hill on a flat line. Kara rests the state's case for the day earlier than expected to keep the rhythm from turning punitive. The judge dismisses the jurors for lunch and calls counsel to the bench for logistics. When the panel returns, Pierce opens his case in the tone of a teacher who knows his students are tired. Dr. Adrian Thorne takes the stand with a reluctant authority. He explains adolescence as architecture under renovation, while the building remains occupied. He does not excuse. He contextualizes. He speaks about impulse control, time perception under stress, and the way intent can form and dissolve in thin slices rather than arrive as a speech. He warns against confusing capacity for planning with the presence of planning in a particular minute. He does not testify that Nolan lacked intent. He testifies that the human brain at 17 contains more weather than map. Kara's cross is respectful and pointed. She asks whether adolescents also form intent quickly and carry it long enough to act on it. Yes. She asks whether adolescents know belts can strangle. Yes, painfully obvious. She asks whether impulsivity diminishes harm. No, not to the victim. Thorne agrees to all of it because accuracy is not an enemy to his thesis. The jury hears a doctrine that can live with contradiction. A former guidance counselor brings a folder that looks thin and heavy at once. She describes Nolan as bright, intermittently engaged, and resistant to humiliation above all. She says he wore sarcasm as a uniform that fit even on days he hated it. She recounts a moment when he was asked to apologize and declined with a line that made other students laugh and made her write home. Pierce uses the story to suggest vulnerability under armor. Kara lets it exist. Armor is still armor when it fails. Pierce calls a use of force trainer who speaks about the difference between a struggle that aims to harm and a scramble that aims to get space. He demonstrates how hands reach for something to keep distance when people feel cornered, and how objects become extensions of that reach without prior intent. He refuses to opine about kitchens he has not visited. He keeps verbs close to the body. The afternoon ends with a short clip from Interview Room A. The judge has ruled that the jury may hear only the sections after counsel arrived and after the second Miranda confirmation. The video shows a boy at a table who looks smaller than he thought he was. Pierce narrates nothing. The words are just words. Argument, phone, stumble, belt in a hand, letting go, bright kitchen, call. Kara does not stop the tape to object. She watches the jurors instead. In deliberative faces, there is a way to see whether a note has landed. The panel does not soften at the word stumble. They tilt a little at letting go. They look down when the belt appears. They look up when the call begins. No one smiles. No one frowns. A juror in row 2 taps her pen once against her notebook and then stops as if she has broken an internal rule. Outside the presence of the jury, the lawyers argue about what tomorrow should include. Pierce wants to call 2 friends to sketch Nolan as something other than a headline. Kara does not object to the friends but signals she will move to strike any suggestion that a kind text last spring should influence what happened at 10, 12 inches late fall. The judge reminds both that relevance is not kindness and that kindness is not probative. They schedule and adjourn. Linda walks the long hallway alone after the day ends. She passes portraits of prior judges and wonders whether sternness once meant something else, or whether the meanings are the same and only lighting changes. She reaches the door and stands for a full minute with her hand on the bar before pushing through. Outside, the evening has the hard clarity of Colorado air after the sun drains behind the mountains. She decides what she will say when the time comes, and feels something click into place like a buckle finding the right hole. Nolan spends the evening in a cell that is noisy in the way all quiet places are. He tries to reconstruct the kitchen with eyes closed. The chair leg, the island corner, the ridiculous bowl with the cracked glaze, the post-it notes shaped like small yellow flags planted in a country he no longer occupies. He tries to remember what he wanted when he grabbed the belt, if he grabbed it, and whether wanting matters after air stops. Kara returns to the office and writes a short paragraph that will become the spine of her closing, whether she likes it or not. It has 5 nouns: belt, timeline, physiology, admission, responsibility. She erases adjectives until the nouns have to stand on their own feet. She sleeps and dreams of clocks without hands that keep perfect time. Pierce stares at a blank document until it becomes an outline against his will. He writes the word accident and deletes it, replaces it with the phrase catastrophic minute, deletes that too, and settles on human error under stress, as if renaming could blunt the edge of what the jury has heard. He underlines mercy, and then forces himself to write the word accountability beside it. Morning arrives colder. The judge reminds the panel that trials are not television, and that their job is to listen even when their brains try to fast forward. Pierce calls 2 friends who describe Nolan as funny when safe, guarded when proud, and loyal to a fault with people who did not expect it. They add nothing about kitchens. Kara thanks them and sits back down without a question. Kara recalls Dr. Cross one last time to respond to a hypothetical that is not hypothetical. If a strap is pulled across the front of the neck, even for a brief period, what happens? Blood flow alters. Airway narrows. Consciousness dims. Injury occurs. Could someone believe they were only keeping distance and still cross the line where oxygen cannot be negotiated? Yes. Is that intent? That is law. She stops there because explanations have limits. The court breaks early so that counsel can prepare for closings. The judge will charge the jury in the morning. In the quiet that follows, the courtroom looks like a room waiting to be a room again, the way kitchens look in real estate photos before families bring their noise. The easel sheets lean in a corner with their rectangles and circles and numbers. Someone has drawn 10. 12 inches the margin, and boxed it twice. No one erases it. Defense cases breathe differently. They arrive after the state has spoken for days, and they must both agree and disagree with what everyone has already inhaled. Pierce walks into that air with a hand on the back of Nolan's chair, as if steadying him against a current only he can feel. He calls a teacher who once saw past posture. She tells the jury that Nolan wrote a lab report in 10th grade that read like a young mechanic's prayer. Precise, a little arrogant, full of the pleasure of getting things right. She says he learned early that a smirk protected fragile drafts from ridicule. She tells a small story about a project partner who failed him, and how Nolan finished both halves and then accepted a lower grade, rather than explain. She is not sure if that was pride or fear of exposure. The jury receives the detail and lets it rest without deciding. A youth coach follows, a man with the patient cadence of someone who has taught hundreds to tolerate failure. He says Nolan disliked drills and loved scrimmage, that he would rather improvise than repeat, and that sometimes he mistook stubbornness for leadership. When a game turned chippy, Nolan withdrew instead of escalating. The coach says he never saw him take a swing. He pauses and adds that absence is not proof of future, only a record of past. On cross, Kara thanks them both for showing something beyond a headline, and then invites the boundary back in. A boy can be bright and brittle at once. A boy can hide incompetence. A boy can withdraw until someone corners him and then choose something catastrophic to feel big again. Neither witness will argue. Their faces say they know these sentences from their own lives. Pierce brings Dr. Thorne back for a narrow corridor of testimony. He asks about the minute perception during acute stress, the way 30 seconds can feel like a tunnel that does not allow distance between thought and action. Thorne explains that intention can coagulate in a breath, and that adolescents often mistake the sharpness of anger for clarity. He is careful. He does not hold Nolan on his shoulders. He simply loosens the rope the state has thrown around the word intent. Kara's cross reaches for the rope and ties a second knot. Pressure on a neck is a known risk, she says, even to children. The brain may be fog, but the body understands breath. Thorne agrees. She asks whether adolescents also know how to stop when someone collapses. Yes. She asks whether choosing a tool that tightens when pulled from both ends communicates anything about purpose. Thorne says that is for the jury. He is dismissed with the dignity of someone who will never overpromise on the stand. The jury looks tired of experts and hungry for voices that sound like this house. Pierce hesitates, then calls a friend of Daniel's from the HVAC shop, a man who speaks with the loyalty of those who lift heavy things for a living. He talks about Daniel's insistence on standards and about a father who did not praise often because he did not praise himself. He says Daniel believed in the arithmetic of effort. Do the work. Get the outcome. He says Nolan hated the arithmetic and wanted the outcome first. The courtroom hears a father and a son trying to tune themselves to each other and never quite finding the note. Kara asks the friend whether Daniel ever lost his temper at work. Once, he says, when a supplier shorted him on a part. Did he ever strike anyone? No. Did he threaten? No. Did he yell? He raised his voice the way people do when a ladder shifts while they're on it. Then he apologized. The friend steps down carrying a small grief only he can measure. The defense rests for the afternoon to spare the jurors a late-day collapse into faces. The judge thanks the panel and sends them home with the usual instructions that now feel like ritual before sleep. Counsel linger at their tables, shuffling papers they have already read, as if the act of movement could change the direction of wind. Linda does not go home. She walks the hallway until it empties, and then asks the clerk whether she can speak with Pierce in private. When he arrives, she calls him Evan for the first time. She says she has decided to tell it all when the state calls her. He asks what all means and knows before she speaks that it means the years she sanded down consequences for Nolan until the edges no longer met. She says she will answer every question. He nods and does not try to move her to the defense list. Her testimony will not sound like a purchase. It must sound like truth finding its own chair. That night, she pulls a storage box from the top of a closet and spreads a thin museum over her kitchen table. A first-grade note from a teacher praising kindness and incomplete assignments. An email from 8th grade about a Chromebook left in a cafeteria for a weekend. A junior year progress report full of soft words that mean he did not do the work. A college admissions brochure with Daniel's posted on it. We'll look together. She reads text messages in which she softened school discipline by promising new starts on Mondays, then Wednesdays, then after spring break. She finds a draft reply to Daniel she never sent that says, "Stop making him earn everything. He's a kid." She stares at those sentences until they turn into weather. Across town, Kara looks at the witness list and sees the hinge she has been waiting for. She has not scripted Linda. She will not. But she will know exactly which questions to ask and which to leave hanging like an open door. She writes one line at the top of her pad. The world without consequences ends here. She closes the folder without feeling triumphant. This is not triumph. It is a cost. Nolan sleeps poorly and wakes into a rhythm he cannot control. A guard calls movement, and feet line up, and doors buzz, and he counts the intervals between sounds because counting is a discipline that does not accuse him of anything. He tries to picture his mother on the stand, and cannot because every picture of her in his head is from a kitchen, a car, a couch, the places mothers live when they put out small fires. He is not ready for a world where she carries water to the other side. Morning lays the courtroom out like a clean plate one plans to dirty. The judge checks in with counsel, and Kara calls Linda Reeves. The room alters its posture. Nolan looks down at the table as his mother walks to the stand, hand on the rail as if descending stairs in a house she does not own. She takes the oath with the voice of someone who has learned to be audible. She spells her name. She identifies her relation. Kara's first question is about history that can be told without adjectives. Linda describes a marriage that ended civilly, like weather that changes without apology. She describes a boy who learned to be charming in public and difficult at home, like many boys, and a mother who learned to smooth the roughness because she was tired, and because smoothing looked like love. Kara asks for examples and Linda provides them without drama. The time Nolan missed curfew and she lied to Daniel about why. The time he crashed a bicycle into a neighbor's mailbox and she paid for the repairs quietly. The time a teacher asked for a meeting and Linda postponed it until the semester ended, then argued grades instead of habits. She recounts a long list of small rescues, each a pebble tossed into the same pond. The ripples meet in this room. She does not assign blame for the divorce. She does not excuse herself. She says Daniel was the boundary, and she was the apology, and that a child who receives both learns to stand in the apology and wait for the boundary to arrive late and leave early. She says her son learned to smirk when consequence knocked, because it so rarely came inside. The jurors do not move. Some truths are best received with the stillness of a photograph. Kara asks about the last year. Linda recounts the escalation. The thin ice over schoolwork, the arguments about hours, the standoffs over the phone that had become both map and mirror. She says Daniel tried to transfer responsibility by asking Nolan to work at the shop, and Nolan resisted because being an apprentice made him small. She says the house turned into a 3-room weather system. Clear in the morning, gusty by afternoon, electrical at night. Kara steps carefully toward the week of the death. She asks where Linda was, what messages she sent, whether she knew about the argument over the phone. Linda answers, pulling each fact like a thread from cloth she should have mended earlier. She says she texted Nolan that she would talk to his father, that he should not worry, that she would make it easier. She closes her eyes and says she is sorry she wrote those words. They will be the only apology she offers to the room. Pierce rises for cross and begins with gratitude. He asks whether she loves her son. Yes. He asks whether she loves Daniel's memory. Yes. He asks whether she believes the boy she raised intended to kill his father. She looks at Nolan for the first time on the stand and answers that she does not know what the word intended means when anger narrows a hallway to one step. She says she knows Nolan wanted the argument to stop, She cannot say he wanted his father to stop breathing. Pierce thanks her and sits. The jurors breathe again. After lunch, the courtroom hears from Daniel's sister, Mara, for what the law calls victim impact, and what people call the part where the price is counted aloud. She talks about a brother who taught her to read engine sounds the way others read weather, who arrived with a socket set when others arrived with wine, who made chili terrible enough to be remembered and good enough to be missed. She describes her nephew as a boy who needed more fences than she could build in a weekend. She cries once and wipes her face with the briskness of someone who dislikes letting the world see her water. She says she forgives what she can and cannot forgive the rest and does not know which is which yet. Nolan watches the floor. When he looks up, his face is unprotected by the old expression. Whatever sat there before has gone somewhere it will not return from. Pierce places his palm flat on the table to remind him to stay still. The gesture works only as long as it takes Nolan to remember that his mother said the sentence about the apology and the boundary, and that the sentence was true. Court ends early. The judge announces that closings will begin in the morning. The jury is excused with the same careful admonitions that have become their temporary religion. Counsel packs slowly. The room empties into the ordinary noise of a building that has to be many things to many people and cannot become the thing it has been for them alone. Linda stands in the corridor near a window that looks like a painting of the parking lot. Nolan is led by, and for one long second, their eyes meet, but do not communicate. Two deputies keep the current moving. Pierce says to Kara that he appreciated her restraint with Linda. Kara nods. There is nothing to celebrate there. The record will show only questions and answers. The room will remember more. That night, the city sounds like it does when winter thinks about arriving for real. Garage doors hum. Dogs negotiate borders with barks. A single motorcycle insists on being louder than the neighborhood, and then fades. In 3 homes on the same street, 3 different people fail to sleep because a belt, a minute, and a boy's face will not leave them alone. They are not on the jury. Their votes do not count. Their hearts do what hearts do. Tally, retally, forget, remember, rehearse speeches no one will hear. Pierce writes early sentences for his closing on a legal pad that has already learned his handwriting and its edits. He will argue against certainty while offering responsibility that stops short of forever. He will hand the jury a word that is not acquittal and not first degree, and ask them to see a future that punishes without obliterating. He knows the path is narrow. He will walk it because there is no other work here but walking. Kara writes a shorter outline with fewer verbs. She will ask for accountability scaled to the act and to the life taken. She will invite the jurors to reject the romance of a catastrophic minute, and to remember that even short minutes can contain decisions. She will ask them to trust their ordinary understanding of belts and breath, and the human knowledge that pressure on a neck is not a riddle. Linda sits at her table and writes nothing. She washes a mug and dries it and sets it down and moves it again because putting it away feels like hiding something. She stands and looks at the door for a long time as if expecting Daniel to walk in, irritated about heat loss. Then she laughs once without humor because the house she is in is not hers, and he cannot walk into any of them now. She says out loud that she is sorry for teaching their son the wrong lesson too many times, and the room absorbs it like a wall made of cloth. The gallery fills early as if the building has a rumor. People who were here yesterday return to finish a feeling they cannot name. The jurors file in, familiar strangers now, and each claims the same chair, as if that will help them remember what to think. Kara does not waste the morning. She calls Linda again for a narrow path through the last hour that matters. The room learns the pace of the final argument in the kitchen by asking about everything around it. The tone of Daniel's voice when he asked for the phone. The way Nolan's shoulders rise when he is told no. The space between the island edge and the chair that catches feet if you forget it is there. Linda answers with sentences that do not try to be dramatic. She is done with drama. She wants the record to look like a ledger. Kara asks whether Nolan had ever used a belt to threaten or scare. Linda says no. Kara asks whether Daniel had ever struck Nolan with a belt as discipline. Linda says no, not since he was little, and even then she would not call it that. She corrects herself and says she should not repair words while testifying. The jurors understand the instinct. They have been repairing words in their heads for days. Kara pauses and asks what Linda would tell her past self about that evening if she could send a single message back through the doorbell camera. Linda says she would say, "Do not promise to make it easier. Make him earn it." She says she would say, "Take the belt off the chair." She says she would say, "Walk out of the house before the minute begins." She does not cry. She keeps the room in focus as if it were a lens that will blur if she moves. Kara thanks her and sits. Pierce declines questions, not because there are none, but because the air is the wrong shape for cross. The judge excuses Linda, and for a second, the space between her and Nolan opens like a hallway in a dream. She walks back to the second row and sits where she always sits, as if ritual can still protect something. The state recalls Salazar briefly to tie threads the way a carpenter taps a nail that has already been set. He describes the distance from door to island in steps, and the time it takes a calm person to cover it, then the time it takes a person in a hurry. He does not recommend which number to believe. He says both exist. He is released. With evidence closed, the judge takes a breath you can hear. Closings will begin after a recess. Jurors are instructed not to start deciding without the law in their hands. They leave as a group and the room sheds a few coats and sighs. In the break, Pierce visits Nolan and tells him the two rules that matter. Do not react, and do not look for verdicts in words that are not verdicts. Nolan says he understands. He looks like a student before an exam he did not study for because he could not imagine the class would matter later. The jury returns, and Kara begins. She does not retell the story with adjectives. She places facts on the table one at a time and lets them sit there without company. A boy-shaped figure at 10:12 crossing a driveway. A flashlight spike at 10:11 pointed at the floor. A phone that locks at 10 hours 11 minutes and 47 seconds and dials at 10 hours 13 minutes and 12 seconds. A kitchen where the belt was by the island and the body was on the floor and a chair leg left a mark. A medical examiner who spoke about pressure and breath without drama. A mother who explained a world where consequences arrived late and left early until the night they arrived all at once. She asks the jurors to use their plain knowledge of belts and necks. She says the law does not require them to accept a romance about accident when the mechanism is so ordinary. She says First Degree is not a poem about planning. It is a decision proven by action and timing. She reminds them that Nolan admitted contact and proximity and anger and chose, in that minute, an instrument that tightens when pulled and stops when released. She says stopping did not happen until life had already passed beyond reach. She does not speak of smirks. She does not need to. She asks for a verdict that tells the truth about a father who died and a son who crossed a line that everyone in this room knows. She finishes without raising her voice. The silence that follows is not theatrical. It is the sound of a scale finding stillness. Pierce rises and carries grief differently. He asks the jurors to remember what it felt like to be 17 in a house where you believed you were already judged, where your worst face became your only face because it kept people from seeing you afraid. He does not ask them to like Nolan. He asks them to measure the minute without borrowing power from the picture taken of a mouth at rest. He asks them to consider lesser forms of guilt that speak in decades instead of forever. He points to the lack of deep abrasions, to the tidy kitchen, to the possibility that panic used the belt as a clumsy distance maker and turned, in a blink, into catastrophe. He says intent is not a guess. It requires proof that is not just plausible but persuasive. He says the state has built a strong ladder, but that the top rung, the decision to kill, remains a reach. He asks them to step down one offense and still hold Nolan accountable. He sits with the dignity of someone who will accept the jury's answer and argue again only if the law demands it. The judge reads the instructions in a voice that has taught this class many times. Definitions of intent, causation, reasonable doubt, the hierarchy of offenses. The jurors hold the papers as if they are recipes, and the meal will be heavy. They are sent out. The door closes. The room exhales a tired breath. Deliberations begin in a square room with a too small clock. The jurors take an initial poll to measure the distance. It is close but not final. They talk about 10-12, like a person who will not leave the party. They talk about belts as objects that mean different things depending on whose hand holds them. They talk about the mother and whether truth told in pain is more reliable or simply more vivid. They talk about the flashlight because the line is thin, and they have learned to respect thin lines. An hour in, A voice is raised, and then lowered with an apology. A diagram is drawn on a legal pad. Someone draws the island too big, and then erases it, and draws it again. They replay the 911 call and listen for fear. It is there, one says, and another says fear can be performed. They agree that both can be true and that only actions get votes. They eat crackers like students and sip water like athletes, being careful about weight class. They ask for a readback of limited testimony. Dr. Cross on duration and pressure, Priya on the flashlight and the phone lock, Linda on the apology and the boundary. The judge obliges. They return to their room, looking older than they did this morning. Near late afternoon, as the building changes light the way mountains do, the panel sends a note that they have reached a decision. The room reassembles itself. Counsel take their tables like lifeboats. Nolan sits as if he has been told to become furniture. Linda places her hands together and interlaces her fingers and does not pray. She does not borrow words now. The verdict reads guilty on first-degree murder. The words are plain and complete. Someone in the gallery inhales sharply. Nolan's face does not find the old expression. For a second, nothing happens inside it. Then a small tremor runs along his jaw, as if a wire inside tightened. The judge thanks the jurors and sets sentencing for the next morning. The panel is excused with gratitude. No one knows how to return. They leave the room carrying the weight of decision. The way people carry coats they no longer need when weather changes faster than plans. As the deputies move to guide Nolan out, he turns toward the second row and speaks before he is told not to. It is not loud. It is not rehearsed. He says, "Mom," and then his throat closes around the rest. A deputy places a hand on his shoulder, and the room remembers that it is a courthouse. Linda does not stand. She only opens her hands in her lap as if to show that they are empty now. In the corridor, a reporter asks Kara whether the smirk mattered. She says the evidence mattered. In another corridor, Pierce tells a microphone that they respect the jury and will explore all legal options. He does not say the words appeal or error. He says options because today does not have room for other nouns. Night returns with the flattening certainty of winter weather. The city lights look like too many small decisions made at once. In 3 houses, 3 televisions talk about belts and minutes and first degree, and a mother who did not cry when she said the sentence about the boundary. People nod at their screens as if the show has ended. It has not. Sentencing stands at the door like a figure in a dark coat waiting to be invited in. Sentencing morning pinches the air thin. The courtroom assembles with a quiet that sounds like weather holding back. The jury is gone. What remains is a judge, 2 tables, a boy who has been told to become a man by decree, and a gallery that knows the difference between verdict and consequence. Kara begins not with thunder but with accounting. She lists Daniel's life in plain units. Years worked, taxes paid, small generosities unreported because that is how decent people do them. She names the cost to a sister who will inventory a garage without the man who could name each tool in the dark. She names the cost to a city that loses a reliable craftsman and gains a cautionary headline. She asks for the maximum because first degree requires a sentence that speaks in decades loud enough to be heard by people who think minutes are sovereign. She does not villainize Nolan beyond the conviction the jury returned. She uses the word decision once and lets it sit without ornament. She reminds the court that the mechanism was intimate and the time short, that there are deaths you can commit without meaning to because you were reckless, and there are deaths that require the choosing of a tool that tightens when pulled. She asks for 90 years. She does not say forever. The word hangs there anyway. Pierce stands with paper he will barely need. He concedes grief and names it correctly. Daniel's life is the first sentence in this room. Then he asks the court to sentence a human being and not a symbol. He says Nolan's face will continue to be a billboard for other people's arguments. But here, today, the law can choose precision over performance. He asks for a term that leaves a narrow path toward a future measured in more than 3 prison jobs and a rack of paperbacks. He says mercy is not weakness. It is an investment in the person the state will release someday. He does not promise the return. He only asks the court to buy the bond. Linda is called for allocution and declines, and then reconsiders halfway to her seat. She turns back and says she will speak. The clerk swears her again, and the room resets around a woman who has learned to occupy a witness chair without becoming an apology. She looks at the judge, and then at Nolan, and then not at him, because looking at him becomes all she can do when she starts. She tells the court that she loved a husband in the way people love when they are figuring out how to love themselves. She says she raised a son in a world that treated consequences as rude, and she contributed to the rudeness by protecting him. She says she said the phrase, "I'll handle it," too many times and trained her boy to expect someone to arrive before the world did. She says she dislikes the word enablement because it feels like jargon, but she cannot find a better one that says she made it easier for him to be careless with other people's time and worry. She says Daniel was the boundary and that she mocked him for it when she was tired, and that Nolan learned the mockery like a second alphabet. She says she wants the court to know she is not here to ask for leniency the way she always asked for leniency. She says she is here to ask for a sentence that tells her son that reality outruns all mothers eventually. She says she hopes the sentence is heavy enough to shape him, and not so heavy it obliterates him. She sits and places her hands together as if concluding a prayer she did not say out loud. The judge thanks her with the kind of gratitude that does not glow because glowing would turn the moment into theater. A probation officer reads a report that sounds like bureaucracy until a sentence catches. The defendant displays cognitive strengths and a pattern of minimizing responsibility under stress. A victim services advocate reads a statement from a neighbor who will never again hear late-night footsteps without seeing a belt. The clerk notes submissions for the record that will outlive the headlines. The court invites Nolan to speak. He does not rise at first. Pierce touches his sleeve, and the boy stands, and remains a boy for one more minute by the angle of his shoulders. He says he is sorry, and the room does not accept it because it cannot. He says he loved his father, and the sentence falls like a tool on a concrete floor, making a sound that is true and not enough. He says he did not mean to kill anyone, and the judge's face does not alter because this is a time for sentences with periods, not commas. He tries to continue, and the words crowd the exit. He sits. Before the pronouncement, the judge speaks to the room as if returning borrowed furniture. The remarks are not a sermon. They are an inventory. The court notes the intimacy of the mechanism and the speed of the minute, the absence of defensive wounds, and the presence of a tool that tightens only when someone keeps pulling, the timeline that pointed to 10, 12, the words spoken in an interview after counsel arrived, the mother's testimony that drew a line under a childhood without timely fences. The court notes that adolescents make catastrophic decisions, and that catastrophic decisions carry catastrophic consequences in adult court. The judge says that sentencing is not the time to rewrite the jury's verdict into something more palatable. The judge says the law must say what it means, or it will be replaced by performance. The judge says that the sentence must speak to the memory of Daniel Reeves, to the safety of a community that lives in houses with chairs and belts and doorbells, and to the possibility that any other 17-year-old who finds his hands on a strap will feel the weight of these years pressing against his wrists before he pulls. When the judge turns to formal language, the room becomes ceremonial, even for those who do not like ceremony. Nolan is sentenced to 90 years in the custody of the Department of Corrections, with credit for time served. The sentence structured so that parole is not a meaningful word on any calendar he knows. The gavel does not strike loudly. It does not have to. People who have never been in this room before feel older at once. Nolan's face empties rather than breaks. The old expression cannot find purchase. For the first time since the first hearing, fear becomes visible enough to read. It is not instructive. It is human. He turns his head toward the second row and does not speak because words will become a sound he can't control. Linda holds her breath and releases it because breathing is the only thing that remains for some minutes. As deputies step forward, something small in Nolan resists the choreography. He pulls his arm away, and the gesture is adolescent in its last second of freedom. A deputy tightens grip out of training, not anger. Nolan says a word that is either please or mom, and neither word changes the scene. He composes himself because there is nothing else left to do and the hallway awaits. Sentencing creates a second kind of silence, the one that follows a storm and takes inventory of roofs. Counsel thank the court in voices that are workmanlike rather than sincere, because sincerity would ask them to confess something they cannot confess and keep doing their jobs. The clerk reads numbers into the microphone, with a patience that makes them sound like addresses in a town everyone is leaving. Reporters cluster at the bottom of the stairs and phrase grief into copy. A column runs the next day about a city that loves tools and rules, and households where both keep the light bills paid, and how this case taught no lesson that was not already in the user manual everybody ignores. Another essay describes the look on a mother's face, and refuses to turn it into an argument. It simply paints it and leaves it to dry. In the holding corridor, Nolan asks Pierce how many years 90 is. Pierce answers with arithmetic Nolan can do. More than your childhood, and more than your 20s, and more than most of the books you were going to read because someone told you to. He says there will be classes and work and a schedule you will learn to recite like a creed. He says there will be chances to do small good in a place that does not care, and that he should take them. Nolan nods and does not argue, which is a new posture he has not practiced. Kara steps into a stairwell and leans against a rail because victory is a word that does not belong to this building. She thinks of Daniel's sister and the garage, the socket set, the terrible chili pot. She thinks of the doorbell timestamp and wishes she had never learned to love numbers, because some numbers you do not want to win. She exhales and returns to her office because there is always another file, another kitchen, pretending it will never be a courtroom. Linda walks out into a parking lot that has not changed. Air bites. Sky expands. She sits in her car without turning the key. She says out loud that she did the right thing, and then asks whom she is telling. She takes her phone and deletes the draft replies that ask the world to be soft for her son, because softness has retired from this field. She types a message to Mara, Daniel's sister. I am sorry, and I will help with the garage if you will have me. She does not send it. Then she does. That evening, the neighborhood that once watched porch lights blink without interest moves its trash bins to the curb with unusual care. Someone scrubs a belt clean of drywall dust and loops it through a pair of jeans with attention he has not used in years. A boy 2 streets over texts his mother that he will be late and then changes his mind and comes home. The world does not transform. It adjusts a notch. News anchors say 90 years and redistribute the word son across a teleprompter as if its syllable count had changed. Social feeds spend a day loud and then move on because attention must. In the small house at 1438 Harrow Finch Lane, a property manager replaces a bulb and notices a faint ring on the counter where a glass once sweated. He wipes it without thinking and then stops because someone has told him a story and he does not want to erase that much. He leaves it and locks up. Epilogues do not fix anything. They inventory what remains. A bus with narrow windows carries Nolan to intake. The city slides by in surfaces he is no longer allowed to touch. The mountains wear their winter edges. A sign on the highway promises exits that have nothing to do with him. He counts the bolts on the seat in front of him because counting is what the brain does when it needs a fence. Processing is a procession without music. Paperwork repeats itself under different letterheads. Clothing changes the color of a person. A man with a buzz cut speaks softly about rules in a tone that assumes compliance because the alternative has its own vocabulary. Nolan nods because nodding is a language he still knows. A nurse takes vitals. A counselor asks 3 questions about self-harm with no adjectives. A corrections officer explains schedules like a train conductor on a line that never accelerates. The first night is fluorescent and thin. He learns the weight of a mattress that pretends to be a mattress. He learns that sound stack, a distant television, a cough, a laugh that tries for bravado and fails. The metal speech of a door. He reads a sheet of paper that lists job assignments he might qualify for and underlines the ones that sound like movement. Laundry. Kitchen. Maintenance. He does not sleep so much as pause and resume. Morning brings a ritual that will carve grooves into memory. Feet in line. Food trays that steam. A guard who remembers first names long enough to learn last names. A bulletin board filled with classes taught by men and women who believe that literacy is a ladder even in a room without roofs. Nolan signs up for 2 because signing up for anything that does not include the word count feels like rebellion and like repair. In a classroom painted a color that resists despair, he turns pages for the first time in months without thinking of timelines. The instructor, a woman who looks like someone who could have been his English teacher if the bus had gone the other way, asks each student to write 1 paragraph that begins with the words, I remember. Nolan stares at the paper until the line stops blinking in his head. Then he writes about a shade sail that snapped in wind and a Polaroid that captured the burst into white. He does not write about the kitchen. He writes about the belt only as an object that once held up his father's jeans when he was fixing a condenser in July and sweating like a pitcher of water. The paragraph is not good, and it is not bad. It is a first paragraph in a room where first paragraphs are allowed. Work is assigned. Nolan takes maintenance because machines are more honest than faces. A supervisor shows him a rolling cart of tools and tells him the rules for borrowing and returning. The socket set is organized by size. He feels something like grief, because he knows how to find the right socket without looking, and that knowledge now tastes like a memory. He tightens a hinge, and the sound is a small, clean click that does not accuse him of anything. In the free hour, he writes a letter he will tear up. Dear Mom. He stops. He writes again. Dear Linda. He stops. He writes Dear Ma, and leaves it. He tells her that he signed up for classes, and that the food is better than people on TV say, which is probably a mercy for viewers. He tells her he had a dream where his father was under a car on a creeper and asked him for a half-inch deep socket, and he handed him a 12, and Daniel laughed and said, "Eyes on the work, kid." He does not write the part where he woke up crying and hid it with the kind of breathing the counselor taught him. Linda spends her first weekend after sentencing in a garage that belongs to a sister she once tried not to need. Mara meets her with the kind of hug that does not ask for anything but balance. They open the overhead door, and winter air turns the concrete into something that wants to be ice. They inventory tools like librarians, and tell stories like people who used to be children in the same small house. The socket set sits patient and complete. Daniel's hand had taught it not to lose itself. They decide what to keep and what to give away. They fill boxes labeled with Sharpie that will fade but not soon. Mara asks Linda if she wants the chili pot, and Linda says yes, with a face that says no, and they both laugh, because grief can be kind enough to make room for gentle mistakes. They find belts in a cardboard wardrobe and do not speak for a full minute. Then throw them on the giveaway pile with a choreography that looks like agreement, and is. Priya returns to a normal docket that never learned the word normal. She mirrors 3 phones by lunch and fills out chain of custody forms that now feel like folk music. Simple and durable. On her desk sits a small print of the 10-12 frame, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that seconds matter, and cameras are not oracles. She covers it with a sticky note that reads, "Because, context," and moves on to a case where a timeline will be drawn by a cashier's log instead of light. Salazar finishes his report with paragraphs that will be read only if an appeal chooses to climb the file. He includes the odd small things that make reports human. The cracked glaze bowl, the ring of water on the counter, the way a dog 2 houses down resumed barking the second the sirens left, as if they had been a dream. He writes a final line he deletes and then writes again. Sometimes the most important witness is a distance measured in seconds. Kara stands at a podium in a community forum 2 months later and answers questions about process with patience bordering on love. She refuses to discuss the Reeves case in detail because that is not what forums are for. She talks instead about consequences that arrive in time, about how prosecutors are not the inventors of grief but the narrators of it, and how the law is a tool that must be used with both hands. A man in the back asks whether she sleeps well, and she answers that sleep is not a measure of whether a job is moral. She leaves the building into air that smells like snow and engine exhaust, and says aloud that she misses the world before she knew the exact math of 10-12. Pierce speaks to a group of public defenders interns. He tells them they will lose more than they win, and that winning will not always feel like a clean word. He tells them to treat clients as people who can write better paragraphs tomorrow than they can today. He tells them to learn to love small changes, like a boy who stops arguing with his own life for an hour. He does not use Nolan's name because he is not a teaching point. He is a person whose mail will still arrive. At 1438, Harrow Finch Lane, a new family moves in after paint and silence have done what they can. The property manager leaves a welcome folder on the counter. He pauses and looks at the faint ring that he told himself he would not erase. He leaves it anyway, not as a shrine, not as a warning, but as proof that rooms remember and still allow new dinners. The porch light works again. The doorbell pairs to a new phone and begins a new archive of raccoons. The school holds an assembly that nobody wants to call an assembly. A counselor talks about conflict and phones and the way anger gives you the illusion of speed, and then hands you a bill with the numbers written too large to read. A boy in the back row smirks because that is how he protects a face he has not finished building. A girl next to him does not laugh. She is thinking about her brother and a belt that used to hang in their laundry room and how she suddenly wants to move it. Linda sends the message to Mara about the garage and goes over on Saturdays. They sort hardware into old yogurt tubs because that is what Daniel did. They find 3 slightly bent nails and keep them because he would have kept them and said they were for a day when the bend would be exactly right. They do not talk about forgiveness the way people do in books. They talk about which shelves to wipe and whether the radio should be louder. The silence in between becomes a different kind of prayer. Nolan's classes include a unit on ethics taught by a volunteer who insists that ethics is not a set of rules, but a habit of attention. The man uses examples that do not sound like kitchens, until suddenly they do. Nolan writes an essay that begins with the sentence, "I used to think consequences were something adults invented to win arguments." He ends with the sentence, "I know now that they were measuring tapes for future rooms." The instructor circles the word, tapes, and writes in the margin, tools. A letter from Linda arrives on a Tuesday, and Nolan carries it to his bunk like contraband. She says she is taking a class at the community college on financial literacy because Daniel used to do the taxes, and she is tired of pretending numbers are enemies. She says she brought chili to Mara's, and it was terrible, which felt correct. She says she is proud, he is in classes, and that proud is not a purchase she is making. It is a description. She signs it with love that does not require him to be anything in particular by any date. He writes back and omits the word sorry, because he used it in court, and it sounded thin in that air. He writes thank you instead, twice, and asks her for the recipe that is not the recipe but the story of how the recipe happened. He asks whether she remembers the post-it that said, "We'll do it Saturday." He says he understands now that Saturday was a promise disguised as a plan. He puts the letter in the box and watches it leave the tier like a small boat that might make it past the mouth of the river. In the lab, the belt is sealed in a bin, its barcode now just another number stacked against others. Exhibits do not have funerals. They have shelves. In time, someone will sign a form, and the leather will be destroyed, because space is finite, and cases do not live forever on plastic. Before that day, a junior tech scans it for audit and reads the label as if it is a strange poem. She sets it back exactly where the map says it belongs, and closes the cabinet with a soft push that feels like respect. A reporter pitches a follow-up piece about rehabilitation and is told by an editor to find a newer crime. She writes the piece anyway and posts it on a quieter site, and 7 people read it in full, and one of them is a teacher who puts the article into a lesson plan about time. The teacher tells her class that seconds are units of responsibility, not just units on a clock. A student raises a hand and asks whether that means they should never run, and the teacher says, "No, it means practice stopping." On a Sunday, Linda carries a box of donations into a community center and recognizes the man at the desk from the forum months earlier. He recognizes her and does not say her name because he understands the mercy of anonymity. She gives him Daniel's belts. She keeps one because it held up something once, and because throwing away every rope in a house does not mean you have untied anything. She drives home and places the belt in a drawer with a label maker strip that reads, "Keep for now." Nolan fixes a bookshelf in the prison library and earns a thank you that is worth more in that building than cash is outside. He signs up to help in a class where older men learn to send emails to grandchildren. He works a full shift without thinking about 10-12, and then realizes with a jolt that he did not think about it, and feels both freedom and guilt arrive in the same moment and sit on the same bench. Pierce files a notice of appeal on issues narrow enough to pass through the law's gates. He does not promise Linda miracles. He promises effort and accuracy, and the possibility that a sentence can be trimmed a little without lying to the crime. He knows the odds and speaks them out loud because honesty is also a tool. He plans a visit to explain the steps and bring forms that will feel like progress, even if they are simply process. Kara receives a thank you card from Mara written in the formal script of someone who never wanted to write a prosecutor. Mara says not that justice was done, because she knows that sentence does not close. She says that the process was held clean, and that she appreciates the way Kara asked questions of a woman who had to tell on herself. Kara places the card in a drawer with other artifacts that are not evidence, and thinks about how gratitude can feel heavier than anger because it asks you to keep deserving it. Priya teaches a workshop at the department about digital timelines and puts a slide on the screen that reads, "Timestamps are not truth, they are coordinates." She warns rookies not to fall in love with neat stories because the world will punish romance. She says the point of evidence is not to win. It is to survive scrutiny. She looks at the clock, sees 10:12 by coincidence, and smiles despite herself at the way numbers chase her like songs. The house on Harrow Finch Lane grows new noises. A bicycle thumps against the porch railing. Kids laugh in a tone that believes doors will always open if you push them. A parent says, "Inside, now." And the command carries none of the weight it carried in a courtroom, which is, as it should be. The neighbor across the street, Amir, watches his doorbell app less. He goes outside more. He learns the names of the new family and the dog that barks at sirens. Linda stands in the doorway of her own kitchen one night and notices that she can breathe there again. She moves the bowl with the cracked glaze to a different counter and decides she will repair the crack with gold lacquer because a video told her once that this was possible and because she likes the idea of damage recorded as design. She writes Daniel's name small on the underside with a Sharpie because grief benefits from habits that are not cliches to the person doing them. In a class on mechanical drawing, Nolan sketches an island and a chair and a loop that could be a belt or could be geometry. The instructor tells him that angles tell stories. He draws a second version where the chair leg is 2 inches farther out. He writes in the margin, "Don't forget the chair leg." He does not know why the note feels like an apology that someone else might someday read and understand, without being told whose kitchen it was. Winter breaks into spring without asking permission. Snow melts into grit, and grit becomes dust, and dust lifts and finds another home. The appellate calendar moves like weather maps on a news broadcast, fronts drifting over a state that will not look up. In the meantime, lives insist on happening. Linda laughs with Mara at a joke that would have annoyed Daniel in a way that made him secretly happy. Priya takes a weekend trip to a canyon where there is no signal and breathes the luxury of not being able to measure anything. Salazar fixes a leaky faucet and feels a dumb joy that something he can do with his hands still works without paperwork. Nolan learns the names of men who will not remember his in 10 years and the names of men who will. He keeps a list in his head of moments that count as a life. A book well shelved, a class passed, a letter sent and answered, a hinge adjusted so perfectly that the door closes with a kiss instead of a shove. He makes another list of moments he will never have and folds it until it is too small to read because reading it would ruin the first list. On the anniversary of the minute, Linda sits in her car outside a grocery store and closes her eyes at 10:12 p.m. She is not performing a ritual. She is telling a clock that she sees it. She opens her eyes at 10:13 and 12 seconds and says out loud that she will go inside now and buy breakfast for tomorrow, because tomorrow is another system that can be built on purpose. Inside, she picks up eggs and coffee and a small bag of sugar that will last longer than she thinks, because she takes her coffee black now. The city council debates a proposal about doorbell camera registries, and the chief speaks carefully about cooperation and consent. Kara listens and says that cameras are tools, and that tools take their nature from hands. A resident complains that prosecutors only appear after the worst has already happened. Kara says yes and no, and walks out of the meeting with more questions than she brought, which is a sign she is still useful. A package arrives for Nolan from a program that sends books. He opens it to find a manual on small engine repair and a paperback novel about a boy who thinks he is the only person in the world who has ever felt ashamed. He reads the manual first. He reads the novel second, and recognizes that he is not special and is relieved. He begins to accept that ordinary is a place worth reaching. One evening he is assigned to help an older man fix a jammed belt sander in the vocational shop. The irony is unhelpful and arrives anyway. He disassembles the housing and cleans the dust and shows the man how tension can be adjusted without stripping a screw. The man says, "Thank you, son," and Nolan takes the word son like a neutral noun he can hold without dropping. He sleeps better that night than he thought he would. Sometime after the appeal is filed, a clerk in a high court reads a paragraph about Miranda and juveniles and writes 2 notes in the margin. age, and understanding. Months later, a panel writes an opinion that trims nothing and scolds nobody. It simply affirms that the trial court did what the rules required. Pierce calls Linda and tells her the result in a voice that had practiced both versions. She says thank you for trying and hangs up and washes her hands because hands want tasks after bad news. The story does not close with a lesson because lessons are what people use to skip grief. It closes with images that belong to the people who have to live with them. Linda at a garage workbench, labeling jars of screws. Mara wiping dust from a socket set and leaving one socket slightly turned because that is how Daniel liked them. Priya in front of a screenless window. Salazar tossing a tennis ball to a dog that learned its name yesterday. Hera at a stove stirring a pot of chili that is both terrible and exactly right. Pierce taking a long walk that ends at a library. Nolan under a light that does not flatter. Reading, and the kitchen exists in memory as a room with a chair leg in the wrong place, and a belt that lay near a body, and a phone that rattled on laminate, and a faucet that drip-counted seconds no one can return. Somewhere on a server, a frame labeled 1012 persists. Ordered, indexed, harmless by itself. The harm, as always, lived in hands and in a decision that took less time to make than it will take to carry. There is a final image the mind chooses when it needs a door. A courtroom empty after everyone has gone. The judge's bench, a shape against wood. The flags hanging without wind. The gavel sleeping, where it sleeps. A mother standing at the back for a second longer than she needs to, then leaving. A boy in a different building learning to adjust a hinge. A city that turns off porch lights one by one and keeps breathing. The doors close softly, because the building has learned how to do that. The night continues. The clock does not forgive. It does not accuse. It keeps time.